Hi friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. I wonder if you've ever fallen out with somebody. In the past, I once conducted a funeral service where people from a family gathered together, and some of them hadn't spoken to each other for 15, actually nearly 20 years. I also know of two farmers growing up in an area of Northern Ireland, close to where I grew up, who had a falling out in their teenage years and were still not speaking to each other 45 years later. Today we're looking at a story which is about the same sort of thing, the story about these two brothers who've fallen out, and as a result they haven't spoken for 20 years. Because today we're kicking off a new chapter, Genesis chapter 33, in our journey together through the Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. I'd like to remind you that if you're new to this and you've just dropped into the first time, you can not only go back to the beginning and work through the entire Bible with us together if you want, but I'd just like to let you know that there are always transcript notes, episode notes, sermon notes for every one of these talks that I do. You'll find them within the episode notes page of any audio version of the podcast, which is hosted on buzzsprout.com, the Buzzsprout website. There's a link through there. It doesn't matter where you're receiving this podcast from, which podcast provider. Within the episode notes, you'll not only find links to ways of connecting with the ministry, but also a transcript of what I've said. And I'd just like to add that these resources are free for you to use in whatever way you want. I've put them in the public domain. They're theirs for you to use, adapt as a resource for your own edification, preaching, or Bible study. There's no need to credit me, although a credit for the podcast is always appreciated. But anyway, with that in mind, we're going to now drop in and rejoin the main text as we launch off on this new study, covering over the next two podcasts all of Genesis chapter 33. I'll see you back at the end. I'd like to launch off our journey together looking at Genesis chapter 33 over the next 2 days by asking a question. And that question is, have you ever fallen out with somebody? Have you ever had a falling out with somebody, maybe in your family, or maybe, I suppose that's the case most of us at one point or another. But have you ever had a falling out with someone in your family that lasted a really long time? Something really serious that went on for 5, 10, or 15 years? I've conducted funeral services in my role as a pastor where families have come together who've not spoken to each other through falling out for years and years and years. And I also knew of two farmers in an area near where I grew up in Northern Ireland, who two brothers had a falling out over the farm in their mid to late teens, and they still weren't speaking to each other 45 years later. So the question we're going to consider today, and the story we're going to look at, looks at people who've been through that sort of scenario, but we're going to look at it, particularly in the second of the two studies, about what we can learn about reconciliation and how we might be able to identify ways in which we can help reconcile people who have fallen out with each other. And maybe for us, importantly, we can learn how we might approach a reconciliation if we've fallen out with somebody. You see, there are some really helpful hints to be found, particularly towards the end of this story in Genesis chapter 33. So with that, we'll turn and drop into the main text. Now, if you've been with me going through the book of Genesis, you already know where we're up to at this point. But if you're joining today just as a one-off because you're looking at this as a standalone message, or you found it as a standalone message because you were researching Genesis chapter 33, I think it's helpful if I give you a little background. You see, there are two brothers in this story. As a matter of fact, they're actually twin brothers. The older was supposed to get the inheritance, but the younger one deceived the father, and he did it in such a way that he got the birthright and the older one didn't. When the older one found out about this, he was furious. So his mother actually suggested at that time that it was time for him to get out of town to flee. Now, the younger brother in the story is, of course, called Jacob, and that's what he did. He was single, and he up and fled his homeland, and he actually from there went east and headed back to the land of his forefathers. Whilst there, he not only got married once, but several times. He has two wives at the same time, which was permissible in that day, two sisters, Rachel and Leah, but he ends up also marrying the maids. At that time, the motivation was because of a perceived lack of offspring. So after 20 years, he has four wives, but then he decides it's time for him to return to his homeland. Now, it was the will of God for him to go back, because the text reveals that God had not only promised the land to his grandfather Abraham and Isaac, but also to him. And the Lord appeared to him, telling him he needed to go home. But that was a huge problem because of what had happened with his brother. Now, his brother's name was Esau, and when, of course, he was cheated out of his birthright, he was definitely not a happy chappy. As a matter of fact, he had threatened to kill Jacob. So Jacob goes back, as the Bible puts it, in fear and trembling, knowing that that it's very likely he'll have a meeting with his brother. And that's where we've reached at Genesis chapter 33. He's turning to the homeland, and he actually hears that the brother is there coming out to meet him. So the question is, what is going to happen? Will these two brothers be able to reconcile with each other? And if they do, how can they get it done, and what's going to make it happen? Well, I'm going to tell you the story, and at the end, and probably in the next podcast, I'm going to spell out some of the things that we can learn from it, and it might help us when facing situations where there's been what seems an almost irreconcilable breakdown. But let's begin with the actual story at this point, where it begins in Genesis chapter 33 verse 1, and it tells us this: Now Jacob lifted up his eyes, and there Esau was coming, and with him were 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two maidservants. So let's pause for a second. We were told in the previous chapter that Jacob had sent out presents ahead of him to soften it up, so to speak, so that the servants come back from delivering those presents and say, yes, he's coming back, but he's got 400 armed men with him. So a little later, Jacob looks up and he sees his brother and the 400 men approaching. Now, this doesn't look like a good start to the reconciliation, eh? What would you say? Back in verse 1, we are told he divided the children among Leah and Rachel, his two maidservants, back in the previous chapter. Now, I mentioned that he had these two wives. They were Leah and Rachel, the sisters, and he'd also married each of their maids. So he now has four wives. And what this verse is telling us is that he takes his four wives and he divides them. He's afraid that Esau was going to come with swords drawn, and that he's going to kill not just a whole load of his family, but also perhaps his maidservants and his children. So what he does is he puts the maidservants and the children in front, and Leah and Rachel behind. Now, to our ears, that doesn't sound very nice, does it? So what's going on here? So if he sees Esau coming to kill him, he's going to kill the maids first, and then he'll get to Rachel, and then finally he'll get to Joseph. Now, that's a significant little observation because of what we know, or you may know, is going to happen later in this book, when we see that the brothers begin to get jealous of Joseph because of perceived favoritism by his father, Jacob. But that's getting ahead of the story. But you get a glimpse, even at this earliest state, of the fact that Joseph is definitely his favorite son, and Rachel remains his favorite wife. So let's see what's going on next. Verse 3, Then he crossed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. So verse 3 says he crossed over before them and bowed down to the ground 7 times. So he's lined up his families out in front of him, and he starts approaching his brother. And Bible experts say what it means by 7 times is he actually went forward, bows down, goes a little further, and bows down again, and goes a little further, and bows down again. And he repeats that process 7 times. Now that is an act of great respect in that day. Today, of course, we might bow down once on a very special occasion or meeting someone exceptionally important like royalty. But on this occasion, he does this 7 times. So he's trying to make a point. He's trying to say, you're coming before me, but he's being submissive because he doesn't want his brother to arrive with these 400 men with their swords drawn ready for attack. So how is Esau going to respond to that? Well, the next verse tells us, but Esau ran out to meet Jacob and embraced him, and he threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. So here's the guy, here's the brother who got cheated out of a whole lot of money, and he hasn't seen his brother for 20 years, and this is how he responds. The significant part of verse 4 is that he runs out to meet him, indicating that he's obviously clearly very eager to meet him. And then we see that when he arrives, he actually kisses him and that they weep together. So obviously, Esau has forgiven Jacob. The text doesn't say that explicitly, but obviously by this greeting and what he does in the rest of the chapter, it illustrates that very clearly. But that's not all. There's more to the story. Let's pick it up in verse 5, where it says, then Esau looked up and saw the women and children. Who are these with you, he asked. Jacob answered, these are the children God has graciously given your servant. So he hasn't seen his brother for 20 years, has he? And he wouldn't know who all these wives and children are. He wouldn't know the names of the children. But he sees all these people and he says to his brother, well, who are they? Now notice carefully, what does Jacob call himself? He says servant. He says, and whose servant? Your servant. So Jacob here is very humbly saying to his brother, the Lord has graciously given me these wives and children to me. But in doing that, he calls himself his brother's servant. So mark that point, because we're going to come back to it later. The text continues in verse 6 to 9. Then the female servants and their children approached and bowed down. Next Leah and her children came and bowed down. And last of all Joseph and Rachel, and they too bowed down. Esau then asked, what is the meaning of these flocks and herds I met? To find favour in your eyes, my lord, he said. But Esau said, I already have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself. So Jacob's families get introduced, and they all showed due respect and deference to Esau by bowing down. But Esau then has this other question, who are all these other people? Remember, we were told at the beginning that he sent out a whole bunch of flocks and herds and servants in these tranches, droves they're called, ahead of him. So what he's asking about here, he's saying, well, who were all these? And Jacob says, well, I sent these people forward in the hope that you would recognize that I was offering gifts and that I would find favors in your eyes. And I want you to notice that he's still calling Esau my lord. Now, way back in the story of these two brothers at the beginning, God had said, he'd predicted in fact, that the older would serve the younger, which was the opposite of what one would have expected in those days. And remember, Jacob had stolen the birthright, the inheritance from his father. Not just the future financial resources, but the position in the hierarchy was granted to him by taking the father's blessing. Now, he's supposed to be the one in the domineering relationship between these two brothers, but he's coming to Esau here, and he's saying, and he's bowing down before him, and he's calling him my lord. Interesting. Now, his brother replies and says basically, keep what you have for yourself, as I have no need of it. No, please, said Jacob, picking up in verse 10, I have found favour in your eyes. Accept this gift from me, for to see your face is like seeing the face of God. Now that you have received me favorably, please accept the present that was brought to you. For God has been gracious to me, and I have all that I need. And because Jacob insisted, Esau accepted it. Then Esau said, let us be on our way. I'll accompany you. So here we are, very simply. There's a meeting, and they finally reconcile, and they embrace each other. And he offers gifts to his brothers, which after a bit of a discussion, he eventually accepts. So far, so good, right? Yep. One thing before we go any further. He's several times within this text and conversation with his brother credits and acknowledges that God has done and brought the blessings in his life. God graciously gave him everything that he had. So it appears to me that we can definitely recognize that Jacob has learned something along the way of this 20-year experience. This was a manipulative, deceitful character, but at this point of his life, it seems he's definitely learned that the Lord is the one that has blessed him in his life and brought him favor, and he's indeed acknowledging that. Now, before I go on, I want to make a quick observation. That is, if there's going to be a reconciliation between any two people, someone always has to make the first move. And in this story, we see it was Jacob. So if there's going to be a reconciliation, someone's got to move, and they need to also make the right move. And we're going to look at what a right move might be as detailed in the Bible in more detail in the second of these studies in this chapter. But in the meantime, let's just finish the story and say that they've been reconciled and that they're journeying off together. And the rest of the chapter will tell us how they agree to separate and go their different ways, live in different parts of the same land together. So verses 13 and 14 says, but Jacob said to him, my Lord knows that the children are tender and that I must care for the ewes and cows that are nursing their young. If they are driven hard, just one day all the animals may die. So let my Lord go on ahead of his servant while I move along slowly at the pace of the flocks and herds before me and at the pace of the children until I come to my Lord in Seir. Notice again, he's calling him his Lord and suggesting that he's his servant. So what he's saying is, look, we've been traveling a long way at great speed, and it's taken a very heavy toll on my flocks and herds. We're not going to be able to continue traveling the journeying at the normal pace. So it's absolutely fine. Go ahead, my brother. We'll take care of the animals, but I'm frightened that if I push them too hard to try and keep up with your pace, they might die. Esau then said, then let me leave some of my men with you. But why do that? Jacob asks. Just let me find favor in the eyes of my Lord. So that day Esau started on the way back to Seir. Jacob, however, went to Succoth, where he built a place for himself and made shelters for his livestock. That is why the place is called Succoth. After Jacob came from Padanaram, he arrived safely at the city of Shechem in Canaan and camped there within sight of the city. For 100 pieces of silver, he bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, the plot of ground where he pitched his tent. Then he set up his altar and called it El Elohe Israel. So in other words, Jacob is offered this protection, but he says he doesn't need it. You go ahead, he says, we'll meet sometimes later. And they agree that, and he's on his way. So they're separating, they've reconciled and they're separating peacefully. Then the rest of the story is just about Jacob setting up home in the land of Israel. He's made himself a home. He's got back to his homeland at last after 20 years, and he's settling down and making a home. And it tells us that he calls the place El Elohe Israel, which basically means Almighty God, Israel. He's acknowledging by naming the place that way that God has been faithful to him. God has blessed him, and it was God who brought him back to his homeland and gave him a safe dwelling there. That's it. That's the story. Two brothers who haven't seen each other for 20 years, they meet, they reconcile, and they finally settled down together, but in different parts of the same land. Remarkable. Remember, when they parted, one wanted to kill the other, but now they're able to live in peace. So this is a simple story, a straightforward story of Jacob and Esau and how they're reconciled and how they peacefully eventually come together and live in the same land. That sums up the actual narrative of the story. But at this point I'll pause, because we're going to think about next time about what we can learn about reconciliation from the story and how we might be able to apply it in situations of conflict that we see in ourselves or in the lives of others. Hi guys, welcome back. We're together here and we're in the second section of looking at Genesis chapter 33, and I hope today is going to give us all some practical tips, some practical ideas on how we might seek and find reconciliation in our lives. Address those issues of anyone that we're in conflict with, because this re-coming together in the story of Jacob and Esau, I believe, can help us greatly in that regard. So it's just, I think, worth quickly recapping what I've said so far. The story so far of chapter 33 is these two brothers have been apart for 20 years, but here they meet up and they reconcile and they settle down together and agree to go to slightly different parts of the same land. Now, it's remarkable that these guys have come back together in this way and been able to reconcile, because when they parted 20 years earlier, they literally wanted to kill one another, but now they've found a way by which they are able and desire to live in peace. So this is a straightforward story of Jacob and Esau, and within this chapter, its main purpose is to be a witness to the reconciliation and how they peacefully set up home in the land together. And that sums up the narrative and the purpose of chapter 33. So what I'd like to do today is, we've been through the text verse by verse, but what I'd like to do is see what we can learn from it, and particularly what we can learn about reconciliation in the story of this chapter. So as I suggested, the chapter was very much telling us about one particular situation where reconciliation was sought and found. So I suppose the question I think we need to ask ourselves is there anybody that we need to be reconciled with? Do you need to reconcile with someone in your life? Is there someone in your life that you are in conflict with, or you have been in conflict with for a great many years? So what can we learn from this passage? Well, I believe we can actually learn a lot that is really helpful when it comes to thinking about this matter. And I would like to make some observations about reconciliations. And I have four main points to make, 4 observations on how reconciliation is and can be played out between people who find themselves in a state of conflict or ill will. So observation number 1, and I'd like to say the thing that's really worth noticing about this passage is how they don't say anything about the past. They don't get into this discussions on the detail of what's gone on in the past. Now, I've been involved in cases where I've seen people who've been in conflict with each other, and they wanted to reconcile with each other, even got to the point where they came together to attempt to do that. But in a great many of those cases, nearly always one, and sometimes both of those participants wanted to go over the details of the past, to hash them out over and over again, in a way I think really to try and convince the other person that they were wrong, or actually sometimes even convince me that they were in the right. Now, one person, and sometimes both persons, are often absolutely sure that it is the other person that is in the wrong. So much so that I think there are times when the two people who have fallen out actually find they're unable to reconcile for that very reason, because they can't even get off the starting blocks because they can't agree whose fault it was. They can't agree on a shared narrative of the past, and consequently they're unable to deal with each other amicably in the future. So the observation I think that's worth making here, and I want to be careful about how I word it, but I think that this shows that there are sometimes cases when the past does not need to be specifically addressed. Now that's an important point to make. I think this passage teaches us. It doesn't teach us that that should always be the case, but it does, I believe, teach us that it doesn't have to be done this way every time. In other words, you don't need to dig into the past every time in order to try and agree a way forward. Now, of course, I think that depends on the situation, the seriousnesses of any perceived offences taking place, and the personalities of the individuals involved. But I believe this story definitely tells us that recognition does not necessarily always have to involve dragging up the past in every case, because clearly that's not what happened in this case. And I think it can be helpful and instructive to know that there can be a way forward for you and for other people without having to deal with it in such a confrontational way. Meaning simply that resolving all the details and agreeing on a shared narrative of the past is not always necessary. It is entirely possible for two people who are in conflict with each other to come to an agreement. An agreement when they say we don't really agree or see the details in the same way as how we got to where we are today, but we can still forgive each other and move forward. Maybe even be well disposed to each other from now on. Maybe even be in friendship with one another. And who knows, in the fullness of time, those details of the past may be able to come back and be dealt with and addressed in an easier way. Excuse me. So observation number 1, resolving all the details of the facts of a situation is not always necessary when seeking reconciliation. An old school Bible teacher I read in an old commentary when I was looking at this said this: it is possible to reach a perfectly satisfactory harmony between two people whilst at the same time failing to agree on the basis of how that harmony was achieved. Right? So sometimes people are able just to make a decision to let go of the past and move on, to let bygones be bygones, as that old expression says. Now, of course, that depends on the seriousness of the situation, but I also think it depends very much on the individuals involved, or probably a better way of saying it is the personality of the individuals involved. Now, I don't think that, what I think it's telling us is there isn't an absolute rule laid down in Scripture that you always have to deal with the details of the past or agree with what has happened in the past. So don't let different view of the past block you from seeking reconciliation with someone that you should be reconciled with. Now, I just want to throw that observation out there, that in this case, clearly they didn't go back into the past and discuss the detail of any disagreement, but they still found a way to reconcile and live harmoniously thereafter nonetheless. So that's observation number 1 about dealing with conflict. The second observation I'd like to make is, and I mentioned this earlier, and I mentioned it as we went through the text, in fact, several times, is that for there to be reconciliation between two parties, someone has to initiate, someone has to make the first move. And perhaps it should be, as in this case, the guilty one who is the initiator in a sense of the problem, is seen to be the one who moves first. Jacob, as we know, quite a few chapters back, 20 years back in fact, he was the one who cheated Esau. And in this story, he is seen to be the one who makes the first move. Now, I don't believe it always should have to be that way. And as a matter of fact, in the New Testament, there are passages that talk about reconciliation. And when Jesus is speaking on it, if we look in Matthew's Gospel, well, in one of these situations in Matthew chapter 5, and then there's another situation in Matthew chapter 18. Now, in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is seen to say, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn them to the other cheek also. So he's clearly pointing to a scenario where, having received the offense, Jesus says the offended one is the one who is to immediately initiate forgiveness. Yet in Matthew 18, we see this situation where Peter comes to Jesus and asks, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother and sister who has sinned against me? Up to 7 times, Jesus answered, and I tell you, not 7 times, but 70 times. So it seems to me in Matthew, there's a suggestion, at least, that Jesus is saying that even if you're the guilty person, that you may need to go first, because that person is coming up and asking for their forgiveness, and you are then compelled to forgive them. So in Matthew 18, the guilty person initiates and you reconcile, and in Matthew chapter 5, it is the other person who is guilty, and yet you still need to go first. So what this tells me is that, you know what, there isn't any hard and fast rule about this, except obviously someone has got to make the first move. But here's the rubber, here's the stinger, friends. What this also tells me is that if you're a believer in Jesus Christ and the other person is not, then we are the ones who should always be prepared to make the first move. Observation number 3, and this is very important. Humility is always needed. This whole situation, this whole process has to be wrapped up in humility. Jacob is seen to approach Esau here with an extremely humble attitude. In fact, he calls him Lord, and he refers to himself as his servant. I pointed that out several times as we went through the passage. It happens many times in that chapter, and the fact that it happens over and over again is a narrative technique used to reflect the fact that Jacob was coming with an extremely humble attitude. So let's just pause and talk about humility and what it looks like in these situations for a minute. Humility will always begin with acknowledging the Lord and our position, our moral position as we stand before him, our position as sinners as we stand before a holy God. Throughout Jacob's first meeting with Esau, he is seen to acknowledge first the Lord's blessing in his life, pointing out the blessings he's received and all that God has done in multiplying his flocks, herds, and family in his life. And I pointed this out as we went through the passage, didn't it? And after the first meeting, Jacob was seen to have praised the Lord. And the passage ends, the entire chapter ends with him acknowledging the Lord again. Now that's a helpful, useful insight, because you see, this humble position for the Lord is one thing, but our natural fall in human nature is not to be humble. It is to be proud. We want to boast and say, look at me, look at what I've done. You see, if we just in life compare ourselves to other people, we can very easily end up proud of the fact that we are better than some other people out there. We'll always find people who were better than. When I've talked to people about the gospel and about their need of salvation, I have had many people say to me, but I'm a good person. And they'll sometimes say things like, I've never hurt anybody, I've never stolen anything, I've never killed anybody. It's interesting to me, they pick the commandments that they haven't broken, right? But ask yourselves, have you ever told a lie? Well, maybe once or twice, now and again, maybe in the past. Or how about, have you ever been jealous of anyone? Have you ever coveted something? Have you ever desired something that was not your own? Now that's a tough one, because these commandments, they don't just ask what we've done or not done, they ask us about how we feel. They actually, by nature, address our human nature, and they convict us. So we can't just pick commandments that we happen to have obeyed and hold them up as examples of why we are why we have something to be proud of. You see, the point is that if we compare ourselves with other people, we can always come out looking pretty good. I'm better than so-and-so, or I'm better than I used to be. And if you compare yourself to other people, you can always find people who are a lot worse than you. There's plenty of those out there. But you see, when you compare yourself to Jesus, then humility comes rather swiftly to the surface. It must do in that scenario. So the Bible says, don't compare yourself against other people or other people's standards. Compare yourself against God and his perfect standard. Compare yourself against Jesus Christ, his only Son, his life, his death, his ministry, his death. Because the Bible says we have all sinned and come short of the glory of God. So God's Son Jesus is the only standard. And if we really see ourselves as compared to him, then there is nothing to be proud about. But there is a whole lot to be humble about. Now in this story here, a lot has happened in Jacob's life. A lot has happened during his 20 years away from home in exile. And he's come back 20 years later, clearly a more humble man. Jacob here is acknowledging his faults, and he has an entirely different perspective on the past and on his brother. And I would suggest he's also got an entirely different perspective on himself, as that evening spent wrestling with God has brought him to a position of humility before the Lord. So much so that it touched him in a way that will be visible for the rest of his life. The Lord is almighty, he says in this chapter. The Lord is my master, he says. I am his servant. And because of that, he also declares it's the motivation, I believe, that he's prepared to submit himself in humility, not only before God, but before his brother in this situation also. I can't think of a better piece of advice to give you if you're looking to reconcile with someone else than to do what Jacob does and to approach that situation and that other person with a complete attitude of humility. One that recognizes your position as someone who has been forgiven by the Lord, but also recognizing that other person was made in the image of God and is worthy of your compassion. Remembering that Christ died for them as well will always be helpful when approaching someone and seeking reconciliation. Excuse me. Okay, I have a fourth and final suggestion. But let me remind you, the first observation is that you don't necessarily have to rehearse or rehash all the details of the past. The second is that someone's got to initiate, someone's got to move first, and that should, in most circumstances, be you. And the third thing is that when you do move forward, when you do step forward to seek reconciliation, you should do it with humility. But there's something that's very easy to miss in this passage on reconciliation, but it's important, and that's why I want to end with it. And that is the fact that Jacob prayed. Pray in all things, particularly in issues of reconciliation and our relationships with other people. Prayer is absolutely vital. The previous passage talked about the fact that Jacob wrestled with the Lord all night about this issue before he actually stepped out and dealt with it. Now, as we've done this journey together through the book of Genesis, we've looked at these chapters on the life of Jacob separately over the last few weeks. But if you look at his entire story as a unit, you can't help but walk away from it with the impression that he really prayed about this thing before they finally came together. Someone has said, as the narrative unfolds, it's not Jacob's plan that has seemed to succeed, but his prayer is the thing that brings success. When he met Esau, he found that Esau arrived with a totally changed heart, didn't he? In fact, he ran out to meet Jacob, and Esau embraced him and kissed him, and they actually wept together. You see, all of Jacob's plans, all of his schemes, all of his machinations, in the end came to nothing. What actually brought reconciliation was the Lord answering his prayer, and the Lord changing even the most stubborn heart. The Lord, a heart that was of stone and turned against him, was now inclined to peace. The Lord had made a person who was in a hostile position inclined to want to seek peace and friendship together. So the overall narrative of this complete story across 4 chapters portrays the reconciliation of these brothers as in fact an answer to Jacob's prayer. In spite of all that Jacob has done wrong in the past, God still answers the prayer and uses Jacob's prayer as a way to prepare the path of reconciliation in the hearts of the other people. God is the God of reconciliation. The Bible clearly says that throughout. It's appearing here in its earliest stages, but this motif will appear again and again and again as we work through the Bible and reaches its high points in the New Testament. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, in fact, tells us that God, his purpose was to reconcile us with him. But he also wants us to be reconciled with each other, particularly if we're Christian believers. So we are to seek to be reconciled, to always seek to be reconciled with anybody we're in conflict with. And to do that, we're told here first to look to the Lord and begin that process by praying about it and let the Lord prepare the path and work it out. Because in the final analysis, friends, reconciliation is always a work of grace. Reconciliation should be sought in prayer, but will be rewarded by faith and then should be acknowledged by praise. The restraining intervention of God kept Esau from seeking retaliation against Jacob. It softened his hard heart toward him. And this was not the first time in the story of Jacob that this has happened. Remember, a chapter back, Laban at one point was out in pursuit and he was probably going to kill Jacob, and God intervened in that situation and appeared to Laban in a vision. Throughout this whole 20-year exile, it appears to me that God has been working in the hearts of both Jacob and Esau because they have both clearly undergone a spiritual transformation. No longer are either of these brothers being controlled by their sinful passions, their sinful drives and desires, which was a particular problem for Esau early on in the story, if you remember. All of this work of changing character has been done by the Lord. You see, I believe that one of the promises of God, an important promise we see revealed by the story, is that those of us who have received God's grace can trust in God's promise of protection when we seek reconciliation with someone else, no matter how well disposed they are to us. I believe that that is the fruit of the Spirit that we can take on board if we really embrace the message of this chapter. We who have received God's grace can always trust in his promise of protection in all things, but particularly when we seek reconciliation with someone else, no matter how well disposed they are, no matter how badly we have treated them or they have treated us in the past. So this tells me, no more than that, this passage compels me to go and find anyone who we've been in conflict with and seek to be reconciled with them. And I believe it compels you to do the same thing, friends.